The title today of our satsang is Ego, Friend or Foe. So, yeah, in the Gita, Krishnji says that ego can be your best friend, but he also says that it can be also your worst enemy. Swami Kriyananda explains that by saying that if we use the ego to grow spiritually, to find our own higher consciousness, to move towards our eternal happiness, then there is no better friend than the ego. However, if we use the ego to become more self centered, more selfish, more thinking only about ourselves and our own fulfillments, then it can be our worst enemy. So, why do we end up using ego so wrongly? It is basically because of ignorance, right? That we are this limited body sitting here, hopefully with our minds, our body and mind, the limited body and mind that we have, and we want to give it sense pleasures, right? We want to get it possessions, we want relationships. Basically, we want the outside world to please this body and mind because that is what we think is our reality, even at the cost of hurting others sometimes. But when we let go of this ignorance, when we start to really realize who we truly are, that unlimited, infinite, divine soul, then we start to realize that fulfillment does not really depend outside of us. In fact, when we let go of attachments, then we can really begin to enjoy the freedom that comes from that lack of dependence on the outside world. Again, this knowledge is not very easy to come by. How do we get this knowledge? First thing we think is when we look at the lives of the great sannyasis and the rishis, we feel, oh, I think is jhanjat ko chodo. The best is after retirement perhaps, I will go into this cave in the Himalayas and there finally I will be free. But really, does that really happen? In the Gita, Arjun asks Krishnji the same question, because Krishnji has been saying knowledge is better, action is, secondary and everything. So then Arjun says, then if knowledge is supreme, then let me just give up everything. Let me give up action and go, you know. So then Krishna says, no, but you can never be completely free of action. In fact, if you do action with the right consciousness, with the right thoughts, with the right intentions and motives, then this action itself can become a reason for your soul freedom rather than ego bondage. So then, this right consciousness, Yogananji says, how do we develop that? He said, consider God as the doer. We have this, oh, I've done this, I'm doing this. Every day it's like, I have done so much, and at the end of the day, this is what I've achieved. He said, just let go of that consciousness of doing anything, right? Let God be the doer in everything. And you be the witness of all of that action happening through you. For example, if I'm eating, what should I say? I am not eating. I am just feeding this body, which is itself a temple of God. If I'm earning money, it is for those people around me who have been entrusted to me by God. Right? When I work, then my intention is that this is a service to God. Yogananji says that when I work for God, when I work through that consciousness of God flowing through me, then I take care even more of the belongings of others. I have even more enthusiasm, more joy when I work, because I am free of the fear of suffering because I am not doing anything for personal gain. So when we let go of that thought, I am doing this for myself, then all those worries, anxieties, those agitations that we deal with when we are working, all of this just flows away. In fact, the masters say that all of these possessions that you own, treat them as though you are a trustee of them, a trustee of God, of these possessions. A famous Bengali saint, we've all heard of him, Ramkrishan Paramhans. He gives an analogy to tell us how we should be in this world. He said, be like a maidservant in this world. She works in a rich man's house, and when she's in the house, she completely owns the house. She thinks she's working in her own house. She loves the children of her masters, you know, completely like that. That they are my own. But when it is time for her to leave at night, then she just goes. She does not even look back at what she is leaving. Yogananji said, do not focus on the frightening dreams of the world. They are just that, dreams. Do not be constantly absorbed in these. Rather, turn your consciousness inwards and focus on the inner consciousness, the inner presence of God within, our real self. There was an advanced disciple of Yogananji, Meera Mata, and once Yogananji calls her and says, you know, you are working too hard. You need to relax more, otherwise, you will tire yourself. So she says, okay, master, because that's what she called him, and she's like, fine, I will reduce my work. Over a few days, she did that. The minute she did that, Yogananji called her and gave her more work. So she was wondering, how do I reconcile to that? But she said, anyway, if he's given, maybe it's a one off thing, let me do it. Then she does that work, he calls her again, and this time he says very sternly, I told you, reduce your work. You have worked enough for many incarnations. Why are you doing this? And she goes back again and she tries to reduce her work. Again, he gives her work. After 3-4 days, more work. And this cycle keeps repeating again and again. Finally, she realizes, I am missing something here. Let me go deeper into this thought and understand that what is he trying to tell me. Then after some thought, she comes to Master and tells him, so, sir, what if we change the what we do here, the name of that, to service instead of work, to seva instead of work? And then he starts laughing and he says, yes, it's been a good show. So, what he explains to her really is that when we do all of this with the sense of doership, when we do it as a sense of work, when we do our work like that, then we easily get tired. But when we connect to God, when we feel that God is flowing through us and He's doing the work, guess where all that power and energy is coming from? We are not using our own, right? It's God's energy, which is limitless. We can probably do 2 or 3 times the work without getting tired. And I can't but help of the example. Next week you will all feel that in the spiritual fair, because you will, if you haven't volunteered to work there yet, you better do that, because you will realize at the end of the day, instead of getting tired and wanting to go home, you will be like, give me more. I want to stay here. So that is the power of seva, and just changing our motive, our intentions. We need to really get rid of this, me, mine, myself, this I consciousness. Is it even worth it? Just think about it. The lives of so many masters and so many saints, we have seen that they have given us examples when they have left everything to God. They have been amply rewarded, in fact, more than what they wanted. You've all heard the story of the two penniless boys in Vrindavan in Autobiography of a Yogi, where Yogananji and his friend are challenged by his brother that you go and live in Vrindavan if you're so sure that God will provide you with money and you're just wasting your time, etc. First, provide for yourself. But Yogananji says, I will go to Vrindavan for one day, God will take care. And that is exactly what happens. he gets much more food than he could possibly eat, much more tastier food, he said, than was he's ever had in his life. He was given a VIP tour of the city. He was given so much money that he could easily buy the ticket back from Vrindavan to his brother's house in Agra. So we can't even begin to think of how God will provide for us, because we have limited minds, right? We would have bought one maybe kachori sabji in Vrindavan, but he got the chappan pakwan served to him. We can't even start to fathom what the universe can provide to us if we just let go. And so many stories in Swamiji's life, also Swami Kriyananda's life. But not only them, I think most of us, if not all of us, have experienced these little miracles in our life when we have said, oh my God, that's it, I can't do more. Now you have to take over in my life. And we have all experienced that little bit, that prayer answered and everything in our life. So, yeah, I just. So basically, when we have our meditations, our spiritual practices, when we attune to God, to gurus, then we really start to transform ourselves. We start to go beyond this ego consciousness into soul consciousness. When in meditation we attune to the gurus, what happens? We start to feel them within us, their consciousness changing our consciousness, becoming one with their consciousness. What happens? That consciousness of the Guru is God's consciousness, and it works like a magnet to magnetize us, to uplift us, right? To change this consciousness completely. They have that power within themselves. So we should especially tune in to that peaceful vibration that we get in the meditation, that gets generated in our meditation, that joy, that bliss, the love of the gurus of God, and their presence within us. Because that is where we can really start to change. And these gurus, these great masters, are always sending loving vibrations to us. Sister Gyan Mata, who was one of the most advanced disciples of Paramhansa Yogananda, she said, I'm always receiving these loving vibrations from the Guru. She was always conscious of them. Even in his presence, she would not keep talking. We think talking and finding out from the Guru. She would be completely silent. And she would just keep taking all of those peaceful and those loving vibrations coming from the Guru. In fact, in Yog Vashisht, which is a very famous scripture, it is said that when Lord Ram walked into his court, then 1,000 lotuses bloomed. That was an analogy that whenever he walked into the court and the courtiers got his loving presence, his joyful consciousness, their own heart would start to open. The heart lotus within them would start to open with divine love, with devotion. Thank you.
Back to the topic, ego, friend or foe. I was thinking ego gets such a bad rap in spiritual circles and spirituality, and we're always talking about how we need to transcend it. And it is very true. However, everything we are until this point has been because of the ego, right? And the ego is not necessarily a bad thing per se. When we say ego, we are not saying pride or arrogance. Ego simply means, as Yogananda ji explained, the consciousness of separateness, of the soul being attached to the body. And that simply is the ego. And Swami Kriyananda said that the ego remains a central reference point until divine grace lifts us into a state of superconsciousness. So we spend a lot of time talking about this person is egoic or he is an egotist. I am not an egotist. And the fact of the matter is that we are all somewhere in our egos until we are completely free from delusion. So the question is not so much about how do we eliminate the ego. The question is how do we work with it so that it helps us grow spiritually. And you might say even how to educate the ego. And one of the main difficulties in working with the ego is because it's very tricky. It's you are the ego and you're trying to transcend the ego, right? So the ego can play a lot of tricks on you. If you have a good meditation, it will say, "Oh, you're such a good meditator. Don't need to meditate more, right?" And if you have a bad meditation, it says, "Oh, this is worthless. I knew we can't concentrate. Let's just leave all this and go back to our other happy life that we are used to." And so, as I thought more about how we can transcend the ego, I couldn't help but think of the Mahabharata, because one of the central characters in the Mahabharata represents this tendency. Yogananda ji said that the war of Kurukshetra is representative of the inner battle that goes on within us. Many of us already know this. The Pandavas represent our upward pulling tendencies, and the Kauravas represent the downward pulling tendencies. So, in this war of Mahabharata, Bhishma is the character which represents the ego. Now, when I first talked about Bhishma representing the ego in a class, some people got very upset with me. And I still pray that I can find those people and explain my point better, because I couldn't. But why is that? Because Bhishma is such a noble character in the story. There is no doubt about Bhishma being a very noble character who has looked after the kingdom, who has seen kings rise and fall, and he had only one dream, which is the sustenance of the kingdom of Hastinapur, right? Now, when the Pandavas and the Kauravas come into the story, Bhishma very well knows, even when they are young kids, that the Kauravas are really bad, and the Pandavas will need to inherit the throne for the kingdom to sustain into the future. But as time and time again it is revealed that the Kauravas and the Pandavas cannot live together, Bhishma still cannot bring himself to do away with the Kauravas, right? And that represents, Yogananda ji says, the tendency of our ego to not part with material consciousness and material pleasures, even though we know that our true happiness does not lie there. Sounds familiar? So, as time goes on, we all know the story, and I'll cut it very short. It's the war, and Bhishma hasn't been able to resolve the differences between the brothers. And at that time, when the war is going on, Bhishma is one of the most courageous fighters, and the Pandavas have a really hard time killing Bhishma. And of course, Bhishma, not to mention, had the boon of immortality. So, what are you going to do with a warrior like that? So, Yudhishthira goes to Bhishma and says, "Grandfather, we need to kill you if we want to win this war. So how can we do that?" And Bhishma says, and if you know the story, it's a very long one, there are so many digressions, but Bhishma says that there is this warrior called Shikhandin. She was Amba in her previous life, and technically she is a woman, and I don't fight ladies. So if you bring Shikhandin to the battlefield and ask Arjuna to shoot arrows at me from behind Shikhandin, I will lay down my arms and I will give up my life. So that's exactly what the Pandavas do. And as we know, Bhishma lies there on the bed of arrows because he's waiting for the auspicious time to leave his body. Now, in this story of how Bhishma was killed, Arjuna represents self-control, what Yogananda ji said. And Shikhandin represents the will to perform uplifting actions. She is really the centerpiece to ego transcendence, because Arjuna is not able to kill Bhishma himself, right? Because Bhishma is the one who has trained Arjuna. Ever since he was a little boy, he has looked after all the Pandavas and no one is able to kill him. That is because all our positive qualities, self-control, willpower, everything is still part of the ego. We need something outside of the ego to lift us out of this delusion. And that is the quality which Shikhandin represents. It represents the will to perform uplifting actions. What are these uplifting actions? As Vasudha mentioned, meditation, service, being with like-minded spiritual souls. These are the actions that lift us out of the ego. Now, if you look at the story, it is very well representative of something Yogananda ji told his chief disciple, Rajarsi Janakananda. He once told him that you are the most blessed among all because God has given you self-control and the willingness to meditate. Self-control and the willingness to meditate. And when we use the qualities represented by Arjuna and Shikhandan, we are slowly but gradually educating the ego. See, ego is not necessarily your enemy once it understands that we are simply trying to get lasting happiness and is trying to give up temporary pleasures. But on the spiritual path, it's not so easy because we leave all our, pleasures aside and we are striving for the goal of self-realization, but it takes time. So in the meantime, we are sort of stuck in the middle. And every now and then we have this thought that this is too much effort, it's not really working out, maybe I can just go back to my life, right? And so the ego needs to be educated in a sense, time and time again, to be shown when we meditate, when we serve, that look, we feel happy when we serve. We feel so much more joyful when we meditate. And slowly the ego begins to understand that yes, indeed, if I keep going in that direction, that is where my true happiness is going to come from. Yogananda ji said every desire that we have in the ego has a much higher octave in terms of fulfillment when we have self-realization. He said, for example, the desire to indulge in the sense of touch and physical intimacy is just a lower octave of the desire of the soul to touch every atom of creation, right? And so, just like this, we make the ego understand that, look, when we have self-realization, we'll be able to be one with the whole creation. And why do we want to cling to these temporary pleasures? And we do that by following the discipline that the gurus have given us and by using the will and the willingness to perform those uplifting actions, because that is the only warrior against which the ego can't really fight. And so then when we start doing this, we pray. We pray, as Yogananda ji said, is the highest prayer. I will reason, I will, I will act, but guide thou my reason, will, and activity to the right path in everything. We start to realize that when we serve, as we were affirming a few minutes ago, that we are loosening the grip that the ego has on us. And slowly, and gradually, we understand that all these temporary pleasures, they just don't matter. And that's when the ego becomes our best friend, and it understands, just like Bhishma, when Bhishma understood that Pandavas have to win, there is no other chance, he surrenders. And so ego cannot be killed. The ego needs to surrender. But to convince the ego to surrender, the ego needs to be sure, completely sure, through its personal experience that my happiness really does lie in self-realization, in being one with God. And once that happens, then the end is very, very near. Because as we know from the story, when Bhishma is killed on the 4th day, all the other warriors start falling very, very quickly because he is the strength of the Kauravas. And once the ego is gone, all our other desires, our attachments, our likes and dislikes slowly start falling away. And then we realize the truth of the statement that Yogananda ji made. He said, when this I shall die, then shall I know who am I. God bless you all.